welcome to this recording. Today, our guest is Martin Lindstrom, author of Small Data, Biology, the best titled business book of all time, and Ministry of Common Sense. Martin, welcome. Martin's also a fixture on the Thinkers50 ranking of the world's leading management thinkers, and somebody who is essential reading, essential listening. His ideas, what attracts me to his ideas is he puts them into practice with real companies and changes the shape of the behavior of managers in real companies. Martin, welcome. What strikes me, what's the link between your works? You've got biology, which is spelled B-U-Y-O-L-O-G-Y. You've got Small Data, and now you've got the Ministry of Common Sense.
Yeah.
What's the golden thread?
I'll tell you what it is. Actually, I'll try to be creative here for a second and do a circle on the screen here. I'm just trying to toy around with my technology here, right? But if you imagine I have a circle in the middle called branding, right? And this is actually where I wanted to be in the old days. I wanted to be sort of the branding guy. And then I learned you can't really claim that from day number one. So you kind of need to go around the periphery of it. So I started to work with clicks first. And then I had another one about the senses. And then I had another one about science. And then I had another one about children and so forth. And really, as I went around, the last brick in my game really has been culture. And because when you think about it, culture is a brand, and brand is culture, meaning that you have perhaps, if you take Maersk, the shipping company, they have 88,000 staff. And really, these 88,000 staff are all ambassadors for the brand. They interact with customers every day. So if they're not aligned with what the brand stands for, you have a problem. And if the culture is down the drain, I mean, seriously, where do you end then? So what I always try to do is to take the core concept of what is your image and look at it from a completely different perspective. And culture for me is so incredibly important, not just because culture creates brands, but also because we are right now in a time and age where culture is completely down the drain, because we sit behind the screens, because people are not motivated anymore. There's so many questions going on. So we're out of balance, and that's the balance I'm trying to correct here, right?
And what's interesting about the Ministry of Common Sense was the book was ready to go last year when the pandemic struck, but you insisted on taking it back and revisiting it in the light of what we've learned through the pandemic. So from your perspective, what have we learned? What did you change in the book?
A lot, I have to say. A lot. I mean, a lot. Because here's a difference. We have, I think, increasingly infused bureaucracy into our bedroom. I tend to say there's a pipeline of bureaucracy going straight into our bed right now. That means we can't separate private and work anymore. I mean, a lot of people, they do their emails at 2 a.m. in the morning while they're watching Netflix. People are completely mixing things. And I think that philosophy was a philosophy I already had before. I mean, this is fascinating, but in 1961, J.F. Kennedy was the first president ever to attend an inauguration, talking about an inauguration today, but the first to attend an inauguration not wearing a hat. And you may say, well, that doesn't add a lot of value here in this conversation. Yes, it does, because it's the first time a person was mixing private and work. Think about it. When you go to work, you take on your hat and then you'll take it off when you went back home, I assume. And then the tie later on disappeared. And then we installed a office in our pocket called the smartphone. And the last push over the edge really is now we have a Zoom machine in our bed, which is piping us into the office, and we're putting on our Zoom shirt 10 minutes before we go to work. And by the way, we wake up 20 minutes before we go to work. So that whole transformation has disappeared. And therefore, I had to weave that into my writing, because culture is all about you feeling that you have a sense of belonging, that you feel that you can thrive with other people. Well, guess what? There is no sense of belonging anymore. There is no thriving anymore. It's just painful stuff coming through the cables, right? So that really impacted the book quite a lot, and that was fantastic. It was such a nice thing to go back and revisit your work in a perspective, I have to say.
But a lot of the things you talk about, like bureaucracy, have been obviously been around for centuries, millennium probably. The how have they got worse, or have they got worse, do you think?
Well, first of all, Stuart, nothing I've written over the years, my last 8 books, have been new. But I think I'll steal a little bit from Tom Peters, that you can predict the future by being only 5 minutes ahead. And the 5 minutes ahead is, for me, really that I'm giving a voice to a problem or a topic which people really haven't given a voice to or haven't labeled in a new and interesting way. Bureaucracy is not new. It's always been around. But I have to say one thing. It probably is at all-time high. And I explain why. One of the things I learned with bureaucracy is, of course, there's a direct correlation between bureaucracy and lack of common sense. And then you have, in this formula, you have another aspect, which is lack of common sense is directly correlated with empathy. Let me just put that into a perspective for a second here. Empathy, what is that? That's your ability, of course, to put yourself in the shoes of another person and see and feel things from that person's point of view. But here's where it really becomes interesting. And this is where I love this topic. And it's scary too. Human beings have been around mainly because we have had a sense of empathy. When you look at the brain and how it's evolved over time, the brain really did not have empathy in the beginning. We have, as mammals, evolved over time and built almost a third layer of our brain, enabling us to put ourselves into the footstep of a polar bear and see the world from the polar bear's point of view. That's the reason why we are the strongest species on planet Earth. Now, here comes the sad part. First of all, it's falling now dramatically. And a university, Michigan University study shows among 30,000 students, over 30 years, 14,000 students, that empathy levels have dropped some 48% over decades up to 2010. And it's happened because of 3 reasons, in my opinion. The first reason is that we, at this stage, are so obsessed with social media that we've only seen the world through our lens. It's all about me. It's a self-fulfilling bubble, just reaffirming what I think. So that muscle of empathy, which is maintaining that you actually can understand and appreciate other people's point of view, is slowly deteriorating. And I know that for a fact because I was really introvert before I began really writing books, and in particular working on this topic, because I was thrown into so many consumer homes across the world. I mean, at least 2,500, if not 3,000 at this stage. I learned to train my empathy muscle, which were amazing. So the first thing is empathy muscles are falling apart. The second thing is the instant gratification generation is really an issue too. We have no patience whatsoever. As soon as I'm boring to listen to for you or for anyone watching this, you will start to check your emails. And that's my biggest competitor. We have no way of surviving unless we constantly go to the headlines, black and white, yes or no. Twitter, 280 characters. So that's the second thing. But the third thing is what really concerns me a lot. And it sounds completely misplaced, but in my opinion, it's very serious. And this is an experiment done with mothers and their babies. And the experiment was where mothers were creating this frozen face, and babies would create a tantrum within a minute, freak out because they could not connect with the mothers. And that study showed that micro movements in the muscles are telling you subconsciously we are connected. But guess what? They're gone. You can't have that on Skype or Zoom or Teams or whatever. You can't go into a meeting room anymore and say, there's a bad vibe here, because we can't read that anymore. And that is directly correlated with Botox. So multiple published studies are now showing that the more Botox you use, the less empathy you have. So what has changed since bureaucracy back in the days when the word was invented more than almost 100 years ago? Well, what has changed is it's been amplified to an extreme degree. And with that, there has been a collapse of empathy. And once empathy is gone, common sense is disappearing. And once common sense disappears, bureaucracy grows.
Perhaps the Botox is where I've been going wrong then. How do you define common sense then, Martin? Because it's one of those, it's always a nice phrase when you hear it.
Yeah, well, common sense is, in my opinion, seeing things as they are and doing things as they ought to be done. But you can also say it in another way. It is to treat customers, employees, as they themselves would expect to be treated. So again, when you think about it, it is to put yourself in the shoes of another person. And let me just try to put that into a perspective. So one of our clients is one of the larger pharma clients or companies around. They are the largest producer of respiratory disease products. Wonderful company, family-owned company. And they asked me if they could sort of strengthen the relationship with the patients. I said, sure. And the first question I had to them was, when did you last spend time with the patients? And they said, never. I said, never? You know me, right? Never, right? Seriously. So I said, why? They said, well, compliance won't allow it. Yes, I said to them. So I rushed off to compliance, persuaded them to say yes. We had, on the first day, 2 executives from the company visiting with me different consumers. And we end up in a home of a 28-year-old lady, lovely lady. She's had asthma her whole life. And I asked her this question, which I didn't really know was that deep. But I said to her, listen, I can feel you've been affected a lot by asthma. Tell me about your childhood. And she literally starts to cry. And I say to her, listen, what happened? She said, well, I was teased in school. It was actually pretty horrible for me because what happened was that things really went bad. And then I said to her, listen, what did you do to get over it? And she said, listen, I took a straw. And she gave me this straw and she breathed through this straw. And actually it made her show to the world that, she had problems and they had empathy with her. And this is coming back to the essence of what you can do. It is to infuse empathy into organizations, to put people in the same situation and feel the pain. And I think a really good way of illustrating that is a major bank, which recently told me, because they also have established a Ministry of Common Sense, they literally did a smart thing. They said, our paperwork takes 8 days to go through the system. Let me follow the trail of the paper. So the people literally will hold the paper in their hands and go through the whole trail, not almost acting like an email. And what was fascinating in that whole process was they felt the pain the paper was going through. But what they also discovered was all these brick walls of excuses for not making things done. And what they realized was that all the signatures on the papers were ridiculous because no one read the paper. No one had, it was just control mechanisms. It's what an Australian study is calling, safety clutter. It's a study done around how we have safety clutter in our society. And they realized that through that walking through the organization. And this is my message, just like the straw, try to feel the pain yourself. Once you do that, people kind of almost wake up and they say, my God, we have to change here, right?
There's something I was reading the book, and it's kind of profoundly depressing that organizations put so many obstacles in the way of people doing their job well. I mean, you had some great examples of a guy in a company who was mirrored by his boss came along to a business trip. So the boss wants to book on business class, but the company rule is everybody flies economy. The boss wants to check his email, but the company rule is you can't check your email using public Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously we've all come across that in organizations. But isn't it just amazing that that exists? And so I was just struck by we make it so difficult.
I think it comes down to us subconsciously preserving the territory we own. And I think the more we are under a crisis, the more we protect what we have, the more we are fearful of losing whatever we got. I don't need to tell you the competition is extraordinarily tough right now. And with COVID-19, it's even worse. People are petrified, and rightly so, of losing their job. So that's a reason why I've seen bureaucracy growing more in companies than ever right now. But I think the reality is that when you become comfortable by seeing the world from one point of view, the concept of culture glasses kicks in. And you may recall that, Stuart, because I know you read my small data book. And in the book, I'm talking about Kulturbrille, in a German term, which is to see things from a person's perspective and really forgetting there's other perspectives. Well, if I'd done something for a very, very long period of time, that becomes the rule. That becomes the way to see things. So I don't think people necessarily consciously saying, let me create as many rules to make people stay out. But it really do reaffirm things. And I think the best way of illustrating that is to go back to the banking sector for a moment, because I did spend time with this lovely lady, and she was sitting in compliance, and she was responsible for creating banking rules. And I said, what a wonderful job. So what have you developed over the years? He said, 1,232 rules. And I kind of thought it was a joke for a second, but it literally was that number. So I was sitting with this big rule book and flicking through this rule book while she was talking about all these rules. And I stopped at page 200 and something. And there was a rule saying, if you have a contract and it's signed, you always have to email it to the client. You have to send it by post to the client, and you always have to fax it. And I said to her, do you have a fax machine? She said, no. And she looked at me like a deer in the headlights. And I said to her, so how do you expect everyone else to send it? Well, I don't care, she said. She didn't say it that way. She kind of said it that way. She said, I don't care. I'm only producing rules. But I said, don't you destroy your own rules? She said, I wouldn't do that. Then I'd destroy my own job. Then I'm saying to the world it doesn't work. And that's a little bit what we have. So we have two factors here. One factor is my point of view, and the other factor is it's further cemented by KPIs, which are locking it in a gridlock. So you can't get out of it, but it becomes self-forcing, right? So I think those two things are the reason why.
What's the role of, so if you're a CEO of a company, how much, because to some extent they would say, well, we can't know every customer. We can't know every rule in the company. We don't necessarily need to know or have to know the policy about Wi-Fi and emails. So how much detail do you expect senior executives to have, I guess, is the question.
I expect them to have a feeling. A feeling is really the instinct, and an instinct is an accumulation of experiences through many years. That's what I expect them to have. But if they don't have a feeling, that's where they have a problem. A feeling is the feeling of, the nagging feeling of that there is an issue down there. I don't know where it is, but let's find out where it is. The problem you have is quite often, if it's a large organization, you have what I define as a frozen middle. It's a paralyzed bunch of people, which are very nice people, it's not that, but they're squeezed for working hours, they have no time, they have no energy, they're getting all these PowerPoint requests from their boss, and really they're trying to survive, and they're the one paralyzing change coming from the top to the very bottom. So there's two techniques I recommend to do. One is, first of all, if you can, to have the boss going undercover. Really. And I know that TV show came out of the UK, but that's really very efficient, because suddenly you do, as a boss, feel the pain people have at different levels. But it also does another thing. It also sends a clear signal to people on the ground that this guy or this girl cares. The second thing it does is it helps the boss to frame a message in a relevant way for everyone in the organization, rather than saying our shareholders want, our customer wants, rather than saying, well, I understand why you have that pain, and then frame it against that. And I think that's really powerful. And I've spoken to a lot of people which have learned to reframe their message. This is not manipulation. It's just a matter about aligning people, which you need in a corporation. But here's the second thing I would strongly recommend people to do. That is to start from bottom up. To get the mandate from the top, okay? The boss now says there is an issue. Whatever it is, I'm willing to solve it. Take the express elevator down to the bottom and talk to people on ground about the issues. Here's why you should do it. Once you talk to people on ground, what happens is you learn about what is, when rubber hits the road, what is the real issue. The second thing you learned in this process is really important. You gain respect. Suddenly we are listening. And these people will be deeply skeptical about if actually anything is happening, because I've been let down so many times. So here's the trick. You talk to a person. You come up with an idea with that person. You say, I'll make it happen. You jump into your express elevator, straight up to the top. You say, hey, Mrs. Smith down there, have a great idea. The person most likely, because you aligned the mandate in her head, will say, great, do it. Straight down the elevator, you said, listen, the boss is saying, you're a star. Let's make it happen. And suddenly we'll have people saying, God, what is happening here? That will spread rings in the water. And once that has succeeded, you celebrate the hell out of it. You say to people, see this, how amazing is that? And that creates a sense of hope. And this is how a movement is happening. That's how Martin Luther King happened. It happened one step at a time. It's how Gandhi happened. It's how all these things happened. It didn't happen from top down. It happened from bottom up. So bottom up, top down combined is really the most powerful approach, in my opinion.
So I suppose at the moment, executives don't get promoted for having a feeling.
No, they don't. They don't get promoted for having feeling, but they do get increasingly promoted for having a feeling of what the customer feel.
Yeah.
And what the consumer feel, because if they don't like your brand or product or service, either will hit the news or else no one will buy the product, or perhaps even both. So that's a reason why coming back to the straw experiments is so important, because if the boss can feel what a patient or customer is feeling, then suddenly we're getting close to it. And I want to give you a parallel here, and I know you'll hate me for doing it, Stuart, but I'm doing it anyway. I apologize now, but I'll pull up Rupert Murdoch, and I'm not a big fan of him, I have to say. But I will say one thing: he's done an amazing well, we have to admit, right? But one of the things I learned from Rupert Murdoch was supposedly that he was reading every one of his newspapers in his LA office back in the days, and then he would literally call his editors and say that headline will not resonate with you. With my readers, you have to change it. I know, Stuart, you would probably know if this is true or not, but that's the story, right? Is it true, that story?
I don't know, but it's a good story to have if you own newspapers, isn't it?
And what I'm saying here is, if you know your audience that well, then suddenly you also will infuse that mindset in how you employ people, how you train people, how you onboard people, and how you do R&D. And I do think this is the difference between big corporations and smaller startups. Let me tell you a story. Two crazy guys sitting in a dorm room smoking weeds. And one guy is taking a photo of the kid, and they're uploading it on social, and it goes berserk. And of course, the mother is seeing it. She freaks out, and the kid is saying the day after, "I wish we could retract this photo." And that becomes the foundation of Snapchat, a $50 billion company. What happened here? This kid felt empathy, the pain. And that pain has ever since been the driving force in making this company become what it is. And what happens then is, as the company grows older, you will have a revolving door of new staff coming in, which have not felt the pain. And then you will also have legal compliance trying to protect the whole thing. And suddenly the founders leave, a la Google, right? And suddenly actually what started it up and where it's ended has almost like a cliff in between. It's just drifted slowly away. Your role as a boss is to take that feeling those kids had in that dorm room and infuse that into a way where you systematically can sprinkle into your company on a day-to-day basis, so everyone feels that pain. Because if you feel that pain, you're also much more passionate about selling a product, a service, or solving issues in the world, right?
Yeah, two things strike me from what you said. You referred to the TV program Undercover Boss. What's amazing about that is the CEOs have no real idea about their company's customers or employees, the reality, which is staggering, I think. And the second thing that strikes me is that you require people to speak truth to power. The other thing that would change the balance is that people who are suffering, in employees who have to adhere to ridiculous bureaucratic rules in organizations which stop them doing their jobs, need to feel the power to be able to speak openly and to challenge. And these things don't exist.
They don't exist. And really, that's the reason why I started up the Ministry of Common Sense. And when I say it's actually a lie, because I didn't come up with the idea. It's a wonderful lady. Her name is Gail Uswell. And she was sitting in Standard Chartered Bank. And I'm sure you're very familiar with the bank. It's the 10th largest bank in the world, 88,000 staff. And of course, they, as any other bank in the world, have and had a lot of compliance and stuff like that, which is, of course, causing frictions. And I'll never forget it, because he came up with this idea, and I thought it was a joke. And then I realized that's exactly what's needed. And I'll tell you why. The Ministry of Common Sense is an oxymoron of a title. It goes back to some of the old TV going on in UK. It's kind of humorous. You're making a joke out of something which actually is deeply serious. And we started it up, and we didn't expect a lot of people to submit anything. And we had hundreds, if not thousands, of requests coming in. But here's what's so fascinating about it. The request came in because you could send it anonymously. Okay, so that was, again, that sort of disarming of the authority being present here in the room. But what happened was, and I thought that was amazing, people always attached a new solution to it. Always. So as we had thousands of problems, we had thousands of solutions. So the only thing we really did was to be an intermediary, which were giving permission to go ahead. And the permission went ahead all the time. And suddenly we were solving one stupidity at a time. And I think that's really what's needed. Sometimes you cannot, unless you're undercover, or unless you have an intermediary, solve problems either because you're blind or because you don't dare to raise that issue because you're afraid of the ramifications. You and I can laugh about it, but Stuart, there's a reason why you haven't worked in a corporation for 30 years. There's a reason why I haven't worked for a corporation for, let's say, 22 years, because we don't want that stuff, right? It's pulling us apart. Well, think about being born and raised in that system. So that's the reason why you need to have that sounding board, which is making you anonymous and making you heard and make an action happen, right?
You travel the world, and then there's examples in the book from throughout the world. But are these things universal, or are some national cultures more prone to bureaucracy and corporate bullshit and rules?
And it is an international export bestseller, I would say. But I would say there's different flavors and variances.
Export from where is the question, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that if you go to, if you take India and China as an example, I've done a lot of workshops in both countries, and what I realized was when I do workshops in India, there's an enormous amount of creativity and there's enormous amount of bureaucracy making the idea become real, right? If you go to China, there is no creativity whatsoever. It's a very structured regime that come out of it. The way they've been educated has been very structured. So there is no ideas at the idea generation table. But my God, if you come up with an idea, put it on a conveyor belt, it will speed ahead, right? If you were to have India and China marry each other, that would be a killer couple, I can tell you. But here's the issue. Some of the cultural direction for how we educate it have an enormous say of how we handle bureaucracy, how a regime which is doing certain things is either dictating you to do things or not. And that is implicit built into our behavior when we come into a hierarchy of an organization. So some people will suddenly amplify that mindset and some people will suppress that mindset. So it is an export bestseller for sure, but it has different flavors depending on where we are in the world. And I'll take countries which have an enormous amount of bureaucracy. Is Sweden, right? Which is very, very funny. I tend to call Sweden an Americanized Russia, right? Because they do have an awkward balance between cultures. I can say that because I'm 50% Swedish, just so you know, so I'm sort of covered here, right? But it's funny to see how traits of neighbor countries also is going through the crack. I'm in Switzerland right now, the same. So it really, the culture have a huge say in how bureaucracy plays out.
And which companies do you admire? Which companies come out of all this very well, do you think?
I was really hoping you wouldn't ask that question, because I'm struggling with it. And it's not because I'm Mr. Critical. I admire startups. I admire companies which are in the early days of doing things and believing in things and sticking to that and keeping their promises. But as companies grow older, the list of companies which I do not admire is pretty long, I have to say, and it's getting worse. So I probably can't point out one company and say that is the company. What I can say is they have traits of elements which I like. Some companies, the CEO is very prominent. It's a founder. He's still around, but he's slowly losing contact with things. Let me give you an example of IKEA. I mean, so one thing I'm writing about in the book, how I visited the founder of IKEA, the late Ingvar Kamprad. And as I went to his office, he was not there. And I went down in the store, and I noticed he was sitting there checking every customer out. And I said to him during the break, why do you do it? And he said, because I want to look every customer in the eye and see what they feel and hear what they think. And I'll never forget it, because he said to me, that's the reason why IKEA is what it is today. Well, I don't need to tell you, in his old days, he lost his grip around the company. Until recently, only 5% of what IKEA was selling, that's before COVID, was online. I don't need to tell you, complete disconnect with reality. So I admire certain companies for philosophies, but sometimes they also had to be renewed and polished and stuff like that. And few companies are doing that because they're afraid of it, because of the ramifications of losing the power you have.
Martin Lindstrom, thank you very much. We could talk all day. The book is The Ministry of Common Sense, and buying a copy would appear to be common sense. Martin, thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you all again. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Stuart.